Hi, it's Chris Jackman again from the Aberdeen Law Firm. This is the Father's Rights Podcast, and today I want to talk to you about prenups. And yes, we're talking about the Kanye West famous song, We All Want a Prenup. And I want to have a confession for you, or I have a confession for you, and it may come as a surprise to you that I don't have a prenup myself. I'm recently married, and I think this is a situation where it's a do as I say, not as I do. And I want to talk to you about this today because I think if you are either thinking about marriage or you're in the process of getting engaged and it's something you've been kind of weighing and whether you should or shouldn't do it, this is the lawyer in me speaking, not the human being, because again, I didn't have one, I don't have one, but the lawyer in me would tell you that you should definitely get a prenup. In today's episode, we're going to go over the reasons why you need a prenup. And I'm also going to go over some of the reasons probably why most people don't and why I didn't get one. And I'll start there because you're probably wondering, well, you know, you're a lawyer, you've been doing this for 13 years now, why wouldn't you get a prenup? And I can't tell you how many cases would go in a much better direction for my client if they had gotten a prenup. And why I didn't get one, it's the same reasons why the vast majority of my clients don't get one, and probably why you're thinking you shouldn't need one. And that is that, number one, I was afraid I would jinx my marriage, right? And if you've been in that situation, or if you've envisioned yourself proposing, the idea of shortly following up that proposal or that conversation asking for a prenup just isn't really palatable, and it doesn't really sound appealing. And if you were like me, you probably feared that it might backfire and that it might be the end of the relationship, or certainly the end or the postponement of the engagement. And that's the last thing that you want when you're in that mode and you're in this thought of that you have found the love of your life, of coming to him or her and saying, by the way, I need for you to sign this, do you mind? And there's really no easy, great way to approach it. There's not, and I'd be lying to you if I said that there is. And I think one of the real problems is that when you're addressing the prenup, you're kind of looking at your relationship in this kind of transactional way, right? And as men and women as well, we don't think about relationships in a business or a transactional way. You're certainly not thinking about what can go wrong. I certainly wasn't when I proposed to my wife. I couldn't imagine a future or a scenario where that things would go wrong, right? I'm a very optimistic person by nature, and it seemed like a great relationship. I really felt like she was the woman for me, and so there wasn't a thought of failure, right? And I think in some ways too, maybe my thought process, if I'm bearing my soul to you here, which I am, as to why I did not want to get one, is that my thought was, well, if I get divorced, my life is going to be over, right? I'm going to lose everything. I might as well give her half anyway, right? So again, this is the human being in me speaking to you, but the lawyer in me would tell you that you've got to figure out a way, or you should figure out a way if you can, to kind of get past that, and to realize that the person that's there for you today and that's right for you today may not be the right person for you a year, 5 years, 20 years down the road. And I'm sure you can understand, and as I do, that when you look back on your life, you're a really different person at different stages of your life. And I hate to say it, and I think we all have to be honest, that the person that you marry and the person that you are when you get married at 30, 25, or even 45 may not be the person that you're going to be 10, 20 years down the road. And there's a real debate whether the woman or the man that you're with is going to be great for you at that later stage of your life. And it's just something that you couldn't possibly have anticipated when you proposed and when you got married at a different stage in your life. So I think that's how you have to look at it. You have to look at it like, yes, this person's great for me right now, and they very well may be great for me in the future. And it kind of reminds me, I'm just thinking aloud here, that the prenup is very much like what's called a parenting plan. And that's a document that you fill out when you go through a divorce or when you're going through a separation. And this document kind of spells out how your children will be parented in terms of visitation, pickup, all those things. And I always tell my clients that your hope is that document just sits, nowadays obviously it's electronic, but you can have a paper copy. My hope is that I tell my clients that your best case is that document just sits in Dropbox or your email, or if you have a physical copy, in some drawer somewhere. Hopefully you and your ex, when you go your separate ways, can figure things out, and you can be smooth enough and cordial enough and professional enough in the way that you deal with each other that you never have to pull up this parenting document and say, you see, you can only see your daughter on these days, or you see, you were supposed to pick him or her up at this time and you screwed up. Kind of the same thing with the prenup. My hope is that you and your partner are on such a great page, or you're on such a page to such an extent that you never need to fill this document or review this document. You never need to go to it. It just sits in a drawer somewhere, or it sits in a cloud storage somewhere, and neither one of you think about it, right? But I think in some ways you got to view a prenup like insurance. I think all of us have insurance. For the obvious reason that we all have to have insurance, whether it's for our car or our home or our life, because on some level we have to acknowledge that the unimaginable, that the horrific could happen, and if it does, you want to have some kind of protection. And if you don't have the prenup, there's a chance that things may not go in your direction, right? And I can remember many years ago when I was a young lawyer just coming out of law school, I really tried to get into what's called the estate planning area of law, which is really just drafting of wills and trusts. And it was a really hard thing for me to get into. And what I found is that because people just didn't want to face their own mortality. And so when it came time to actually sit down and say, okay, this is what your last wishes are going to be, this is what's going to happen to you when you're gone, it was a hard thing to actually have happen. And I just struggled to get clients because nobody wanted to have that conversation with me. And I think the prenup is kind of the same way. So I want to talk about in a moment here kind of the legalities of a prenup, like what you can and cannot do, because if you're on board with a prenup, you may get sort of overzealous and overreach, because I have read cases and I have seen situations where prenups were struck down, meaning the judge said, no, this prenup is invalid. So there are some limitations as to what you can do with a prenup. But I just want to talk for a little bit longer about how I think strategically you should approach a prenup. And again, I think it's as hard as it is. I think the way you have to do it is you just have to sit down with your spouse. And I would recommend that you probably do it before you propose. I think because you never know, right? You may be wading into waters where your partner just doesn't see it the same way that you do, right? Some people just don't view relationships through the same kind of transactional way, if we can use it in that term, that I think you should, right? So if it's not too late, I would advise you to sit down and just be honest. Obviously that's the best way to go about it. I wouldn't pose it as a hypothetical. I wouldn't say that you're asking for a friend, or make up some elaborate story. The analogy that's coming to mind is a George Costanza moment from Seinfeld, where you're trying to sort of put yourself in the shoes of a friend and ask for a friend. I think you just need to sit down with your partner and understand that, if this person really is right for you, they're probably going to get it, and they're probably going to understand. And I think you just got to flat out say, hey, we're great now, we're in a great spot now, but I don't know where we're going to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. And would you at least consider signing it? And maybe we can just go through what this is going to look like. I think that's the best way to do it, and just see what the response is. And it might be an eye-opening moment depending on how they respond. And it might give you some idea of what direction you want to go with this person, right? So I think that's the way you approach it strategically with your partner. Now, in terms of the prenup itself, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today's episode. And I should obviously point out at the outset of this, I'm not giving legal advice. I don't know the particulars of your circumstance. I just want to give you the kind of overview of how prenups work. The best way for a prenup to work, meaning it's going to be considered valid by a judge if it ever goes in front of a judge, and obviously we hope it doesn't, but if it does go in front of a judge, the best way to do it is to each of you have your own prenup, right? So it's one of those things where you should have a lawyer, and your spouse or your partner should also have their own lawyer review it. So that way there's no argument to be made that there's some sort of conflict of interest, or that you were, and this is what I'm going to get into in a moment as to when they're struck down, is that you're not putting your spouse under duress, right? Like you're not pressuring your spouse, you're not saying, hey, sign this or else, because that's the easiest way to get the prenup struck down, right? So you got to sit down with your partner, go through what you're thinking, right? Because you need to think about not just for today, but also what's going to happen a year from now, 10 years from now. And I want to be clear that the prenup is not going to be held valid if you're talking about custody of your children, right? I want to be crystal clear that if you think you're going to say, well, in the event of a divorce, I get the children, you get no visitation, right? I mean, first of all, that's probably going to lead to a pretty big argument with you and your partner. And second of all, that's what I'm talking about, overreaching, right? You need to be practical about this. The prenup is really for things. And I'm saying things and stuff kind of in the abstract, right? It's talking about what you'd imagine, your home, your 401k, future money that you may be making from your job. So those are the things. I mean, hell, it could even be a piece of artwork, right? It could be anything that's tangible in nature. Understanding when I say tangible, that also is going to include retirement accounts, savings accounts, that sort of thing, right? And frankly, there's also what's called a postnup, and we might revisit this in another episode. But you might be thinking to yourself, well, Chris, what if 10 years from now I inherit something, right? You might be asking yourself, just how far into the future should I be looking? And that's for another episode. So you have to be kind of realistic with what you're trying to protect and what's likely to come your way as you age, right? So normally what I'm seeing in prenuptial agreements are just the common sense things, right? It's a home, it's your 401k, it's money that you're going to be making down the road in your career, right? The thing that you have to keep in mind is it's got to be reasonable, right? So you might be thinking, well, as long as my spouse or my partner has her own lawyer or his own lawyer and they sign off on it, I'm good, right? Not necessarily, so it has to be reasonable in nature, right? So you can't have situations where, and I'm just obviously giving you a hypothetical, right? But you can't have a situation where if you're a very high income earner, you say something in the prenuptial agreement like, my spouse or my partner is entitled to nothing, right? You can't do that. It's not going to be held up. So there's going to be some limitations to this, okay? It's going to have some parameters. So I would encourage you to kind of be realistic about what a judge would probably award you if this prenuptial agreement was ever to be presented to a judge, right? So your 401k, fair game. If you want to protect your 401k from your work, I'd understand. That's what you'd want to protect. And there's no reason to think that your spouse should have access to that. Same thing with future earnings, right? Now, again, it's circumstantial in the sense that if your wife, for example, ends up being a stay-at-home mom and forgoes her career for 20 years, kind of the same thing, right? It's not going to be upheld. It's not going to be realistic for you to say, you're going to stay at home and raise children, and then you're never going to get a penny of my salary in the event that we divorce. That's also not going to be upheld. So again, and I don't mean this to be an endorsement or an advertisement to talk to a lawyer, but I do think it's a good idea to sit down with a lawyer because it's one of those things where you're probably going to save yourself a lot of money and a lot of time if you just sit down and pay for a lawyer for 1 or 2 hours, as opposed to what I get over and over again is people come into my office, they're in the middle of a bitter dispute, or they're about to go into a bitter custody dispute or child support dispute, and there is no prenup. which, to be candid with you, could happen to me, right? That could happen 5 years from now, I don't know. But without that document, you're kind of leaving yourself vulnerable to whatever the laws are in your state as to what is going to happen with your property and your assets. The prenup is really the only way to protect those things, especially when it comes to inheritances, to gifts, because unless you can conclusively prove that these inheritances or gifts or things that you have were intentionally for you, there's a very good chance that's going to get divided in the course of the divorce, right? Or, worst case scenario, if it's not something you can just split, it's going to get sold, and whatever the proceeds of that item are, that's going to get split. The prenup is the only way that you can spell out that says, hey, I get this painting, or I get this boat, or whatever the item is that you're thinking that you really want to protect in the event that you go through a divorce. The prenup is the document that's going to protect you from that. Procedurally, like I mentioned a moment ago, the best way to go about it is for each of you to get your own lawyer, draft it, sign it, and then it's not going to get filed. Sometimes my clients think, well, does this go into the court system, or does this go into a court registry? It doesn't. It just simply normally gets held at your lawyer's office. It's, again, something that's probably going to sit in your cloud, whether it's Dropbox or Box. I'm a fan of having it probably in a safety deposit box at the bank, or a UPS store, one of those. It's not terribly expensive to have one of those, along with your will. If you have one, that's probably a good place for it to go. And again, hopefully you never have to pull this document out and review it. But again, if you're being proactive and you're being realistic, because the numbers I'm sure are even now, roughly half of marriages are going to end in divorce. That's just a fact. It's been that way for 30 plus years now. So if it's not too late, I would encourage you to get one. If you have any questions, I would really encourage you to reach out to a lawyer and get that prenuptial agreement drafted and reviewed before it's too late. Until next time, hope this has been of help to you.